UConn Arms hosts On Target once a month to provide an opportunity for the dissemination and discussion of emerging gun injury prevention work. This seminar is open to all researchers, policymakers, practitioners, anyone who wants to know more about research in this field. If you'd like to present, please email ARMS. We'll drop the information in the chat shortly, and they will be in touch. They welcome presentations from any discipline. Our next seminar will be on June 25th, and it'll feature Benjamin Cavataro, an assistant professor of law at Wayne State University. He's an expert on torts, consumer law, administrative law, and regulation, with a particular focus on products liability and safety law. Again, Ben will join us on the 25th of June. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Michael Anestis, Executive Director of the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center. His work focuses on suicide prevention among both civilians, service members, and veterans, with a particular focus on the role of firearms. Today, he'll present his work on defensive gun use. For those interested, I'll also put a link to the paper in the chat once the talk is underway. So the format for the presentation is that Mike will present for roughly 30 to 35 minutes, and then I'll open up the floor to Q&A. Please feel free to stick your questions in the chat or raise your hand. But during the duration of his talk, please make sure you're muted. And now, please help me in welcoming Dr. Mike Anestis. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the intro. Guys, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So give me just a second to get this up and going, and then swap my present mode. Hold on. Okay. I think you should be able to see it the way you're supposed to see it. So thanks for logging in today, guys. Appreciate the chance to present to you. As you heard from the intro, I really am a suicide researcher at my core. So I don't present on these data very often. I'll explain in a moment why this was a topic I wanted to do some work on. But it's actually a little bit outside of my general area of expertise in terms of where I usually focus on gun violence prevention. I do want to really quickly acknowledge my co-authors, Kim and Sultan, two of our great postdocs at the GVRC, and Dan Simmons, our director of research. And as Richard mentioned, the paper is available. So it's like they're putting up a link in the chat, but it's just available JAMA Open. So if you want sort of more of a fine-grained access to the data I'm presenting, just while I'm presenting, you can go ahead and just have the paper itself up and going. It's freely available online. Okay, so let me sort of jump into it here. As I said, I'm a suicide researcher, and a lot of my work is really focused on trying to get people who are firearm owners, people who have firearm access in and around their home, to store those firearms securely, that being sort of one of our sort of best available suicide prevention tools. But for a number of reasons, there's a lot of resistance to that and sort of very low rates of secure storage. But by far the most common obstacle that I run into, whether we're trying to promote this through messaging, whether we're trying to promote this through one-on-one interventions like Project Safeguard, is you get folks who say, well, I can't store all of my firearms securely at home. I need to have one on the ready in case someone breaks in the middle of the night. I don't want to fiddle around with a lock, and get a key while that person comes in armed and ready. And then, I'm at risk, or my loved ones are at risk, or my property's at risk. And so you very frequently in the suicide prevention world encounter a really strong sort of core belief in the importance of readying the home for self-defense. But obviously, self-defense doesn't only happen in the home, right? And I'm going to talk about this more in the next couple of slides, but really the whole narrative around firearm ownership and firearm policy and staging homes with respect to firearms, a lot of it is just sort of centered around the idea that these are tools to create safety in an unsafe world and to facilitate someone to sort of autonomously defend themselves, not rely on someone else to do it for them. And you can also see this in like survey after survey after survey. You're never going to find any sort of study that looks at firearm ownership and asks people why they own firearms and see a deviation from the pattern that is by far the most common reason people give for owning at least one of their firearms, typically a handgun, is self-defense, whether that's defense at home or defense outside the home. There are some exceptions, right? So when we gather data from different states, Minnesota often stands out as the only one where people say, actually, my primary reason is hunting, right? So there are some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, the primary reason, the most common reason folks own a firearm is self-defense. And so conversations happening within homes, conversations happening in judicial settings or in policy development settings often are centering this idea of defensive gun use in determining what is and is not viable, what should and should not be legal, what is and is not a smart way to think about your home. But there isn't really much consensus about the frequency with which defensive gun use actually happens. Now, I'm going to present you some numbers in a few slides. But I want to really quickly take 2 more slides here just to really emphasize the way in which self-defense is centered in a lot of conversations around firearms. And so, not being a legal guy, I used the power of Google and harnessed that to pull some quotes from the recent sort of landmark, or relatively recent now, Bruin decision, and how they talked about self-defense. And some of these are actually quotes from Heller earlier than that. But you can see the point coming up again and again. So one quote saying self-defense is the central component of the Second Amendment right. Another quote where they were quoting Heller in this one is, moreover, the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to possess and carry weapons in case of confrontation, and confrontation can surely take place outside the home. And then lastly, again, from this same case, the Second Amendment's plain text thus presumptively guarantees petitioners quote good national right to bear arms in public for self-defense. So again, much of the decision making about what folks can and cannot do, what the state can and cannot regulate, are centered around this idea of, look, people need to be out there armed to defend themselves. This is a thing that happens, and it happens enough that when we think about how we want to structure our society and our legal system and what people are and are not doing in our communities, we make sure that this is protected. You also see this from maybe some more nefarious sources too. So obviously the legendary Wayne LaPierre quote, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. But in marketing and fundraising and membership campaigns, you see quotes from the NRA regularly that say things like, your right to self-defense is under attack. Join the NRA and protect your freedom to protect yourself. And so the message is clear. Policy decisions, judicial decision-making, decisions within the home about how people stage their home with respect to, should a firearm be in it, and if so, how should it be stored? These are being driven by a concerted effort to emphasize individuals' rights to defend themselves with a firearm and to facilitate their ability to do that readily without any sort of obstacle. And the nature of a conversation like that accepts as fact the idea that defensive gun use is common, or at least if it's not super common, it's at least more common than costly consequences that would flip the narrative and say, like, well, this happens, but this happens more frequently. And so when I'm making that cost benefit analysis, I really need to think about it. It's really, the conversation has emphasized the notion that defensive gun use is a thing. It happens regularly and it must be protected at all costs. The question is that true? Right? And so I mentioned, we're far from the first people to ask this question. We like our data, we like the timeliness of it, we like some of the ways we asked our questions. So we have some reasons to believe that our data gives some really useful new insights. But we're not the first to ask this question. So a lot of times, especially again in these sort of policy conversations, you hear folks cite some pretty widely discredited studies that have yielded really implausible estimates about common defensive gun uses. We're talking millions and millions of instances a year that just are simply not believable. The flip side of that, there was recent publication using much more compelling data, 35 years of data from the NCVS, that yielded an estimate of between 60 and 65,000 annual instances of defensive gun use in the US. But the problem with those data is that they rely only upon officially reported instances during the course of a crime, right? So if the first example I gave was a type 1 or false positive issue where you're getting too many that aren't actual examples, this is an example of false negatives or type 2 errors where we're discounting things that might happen because we're only looking at it within a specific context. But regardless of the methodology that folks have used and the frequency that the results have yielded, the prior work also has not done a good job of contextualizing that frequency. So if you say this happens this often, and you don't say how that compares to other things that happen that are relevant to those same folks, you don't really get a context. You get a number that anyone can spin as big or small because there's no anchoring point, there's no comparison to let you understand what it really means to say this happens this often. And so one of our goals, and I'll lay out our sort of specific aims in a second, but one of our goals was to provide some context to these numbers. It's also worth noting too that in all these conversations about defensive gun use and its importance and its frequency, there's very little information out there about who are the folks with firearm access who are actually most likely to engage in defensive gun use when it happens. Is it that any person with a firearm is equally likely to do this? Are there aspects of who that individual is or what they've experienced or how they store their firearms that influence this? And so a couple of obvious factors that we thought might play into this are things like opportunity, right? So folks who interact with their firearms more frequently or can get to them more readily might have more opportunity for defensive gun use. And so if that means their firearms are stored unsecured or they carry them outside the home more frequently, maybe that's an influencing factor. Also perceptions of danger. If you have increased threat sensitivity, perhaps because you have experienced gun violence yourself in the past, maybe that makes you more inclined to see threat and respond aggressively to protect yourself based on your own perception of what is and is not threatening and what might come as a consequence from that threat. So we had really three specific aims in this particular study. One was to estimate both the lifetime and the past year instances of 4 specific types of defensive gun use. One of them is telling a perceived threat that you have a firearm. 2 is showing your firearm to a perceived threat. 3 is shooting in the vicinity of, but not at, a perceived threat. And the 4th is actually shooting at a perceived threat. The second specific aim was to determine, again, as I was mentioning in the previous slide, what specific subgroups of folks with firearm access are more likely to have engaged in defensive gun use in their lifetime. And the third, as I mentioned earlier, was to contrast the frequency of defensive gun use with that of gun violence exposure. So again, to give some context to the numbers that we provide. But it's important to note that, I mentioned some limitations of the prior studies that have estimated defensive gun use. Well, ours have them too, right? Like however you frame your question is going to influence what those findings yield. And you'll see the word perceived in all 4 of those examples, right? So we're assessing somebody's self-reported perceived threat. And that doesn't actually give us any information on whether the behavior was necessary, whether the person actually was a threat, whether the use of defensive gun use yielded some sort of positive outcome, and also whether you could have gotten that same outcome by defending yourself in a way that didn't involve a firearm, right? So none of the things that we're showing the frequency of actually tell us if something was real and necessary and produced a positive outcome, all of which are things that are presumed when we're saying, well, this is how often defensive gun use happens. We're just saying, in your own experience, from your own perception, have you done these things? Which is actually likely to inflate numbers because it creates opportunity for folks to endorse something as having happened when it maybe didn't need to. So what was the nature of our sample? So we had a nationally representative sample. One of the things that made us feel good about doing the studies, we had probability-based sampling using knowledge panels, sort of the gold standard panel representative of US adults. There were just over 8,000 folks in our sample. We gathered the data over the course of about 2 weeks around this time last year. In these analyses, we only included folks with firearm access. So we asked, is there typically a firearm stored in or around your home? If you say yes, then you're in this group of folks. And so just under 40% of our sample endorsed home firearm access, which lines up with what you see in most epidemiological studies, sort of estimating the proportion of American homes that have firearms in them. So that's 3,018 people. But there were an additional 18 people who didn't answer our defensive gun use question. So we had an actual final sample of 3,000 people. So we run our analyses a bunch of different ways in different subgroups. But when I say in our sample, I'm talking about these 3,000 folks from our nationally representative sample who had firearms typically stored in and around their home and who answered the questions on defensive gun use. The data were weighted to be representative of US adults, and you can see sort of a general breakdown of some demographics. But again, if you load up the actual paper itself, we have those data much more readable. So you can actually see the percentages a little bit. I thought these pie graphs looked nice, but quite frankly, it's really difficult to read what they're telling you on this slide. I now realize in retrospect, but I do state that they look nicer than the table would. Okay, so I'm gonna give you this one brief overview slide that's sort of, I think, a nice visual of the findings, and I'm gonna go into the actual data a little bit, and then I'm gonna step back and talk about what do I think these findings mean. I'm not gonna lie to you, lots and lots of numbers coming. You do not need to digest all of them, but I don't like withholding numbers because someone might be interested in seeing something. So this first visual, the blue bars are types of defensive gun use. The orange bars are types of gun violence exposure. The darker colors are past year instances. The sort of lighter colors are lifetime. So you can see a pretty clear pattern right off the bat, which is, yeah, gun violence exposure, whether we're talking lifetime or past year, sure seems a heck of a lot more common than defensive gun use, with the one exception, thankfully, being, have you been shot by a firearm? Although that's still more common than half the forms of defensive gun use. So I will go into each of these in more detail, but I thought it was worth having this initial visual up there just to really drive home the point, because I do think it's a little bit easier to see the pattern with the bars than it is with the numbers, but I think the numbers that you're going to see are a little bit more important in a lot of ways. So the first question we had was just based on lifetime defensive gun use and lifetime gun violence exposure. And again, this is for only the folks with firearm access, right? And so we figure defensive gun use really only happens if you have firearm access. Now, could there be folks who have access to firearms that are not stored around their home? Yeah, there probably are a handful of folks that we could have done that, but that's a very different, I think, question than what we're trying to get at. There are undoubtedly folks exposed to gun violence who don't have firearms in their home, right? So we are severely underestimating the population level exposure to gun violence. But we were trying to get at the frequency of all of these experiences within the same group of people. So on the far left, you can see the overall frequency of defensive gun use, which would be the top four rows. And then beneath the black, you see the frequency of gun violence exposure. Again, on the far left, you have that full sample, the 3,000 folks. And then we break this down into various subgroups. So we have the 556 folks who've endorsed having been threatened with a firearm in their lifetime. We have the 64 folks who endorse having been shot in their lifetime. We have the 875 folks who typically store at least one firearm in their home, both loaded and unlocked, so as readily accessible as possible. We had the results broken down by folks who identify as white, folks who identify as black. We have broken down by male, by female, and we also have it broken down by sort of 4 geographic regions in the US. And now, if you look across the board, there are some variations in some of these columns, but there's a lot of similarity, quite honestly, from column to column, with a couple of exceptions. And those exceptions are the ones that I have sort of highlighted in red, which is the folks who have endorsed having been threatened by a firearm in their lifetime, and the folks who endorsed having been shot by a firearm in their lifetime endorsed having engaged in various forms of defensive gun use more frequently than did folks who hadn't had those experiences, or folks in these other categories anyways, right? But what you'll also notice is below the black, those same folks also endorsed relatively higher rates of gun violence exposure than did folks in the other columns, right? So it's not just that these folks were defending themselves with guns more often, it's that they were also experiencing gun violence more often than other folks. These things seem to go hand in hand. And also, just to put things in context, in our sample of 3,000 adults with home firearm access, about, I think it was 250 total folks endorsed any lifetime experience of defensive gun use. But the number that actually stands out to me the most in this entire table, it's sort of buried in here. I notice if you look at the full sample, there were 37 instances lifetime of someone saying, yeah, I have shot my firearm at a perceived threat. If you look at the column of folks who've been shot by a firearm, 22 folks have said that. 22 out of the 37 instances occurred amongst the 64 people in our sample have been shot. So put another way, 60%, or really 59.5% of all instances of shooting at a threat occurred amongst individuals who themselves have been shot before. despite such individuals accounting for only about 2% of the sample. So when you think about the narrative I was getting at earlier, defensive gun use must be defended, it must be, secure. This is a thing that happens, a thing that happens. I think when most people think about them, and they're thinking again from the suicide prevention perspective, I want to keep my firearm stored loaded and unlocked. I can't do the secure storage thing. Someone might break into my home and I might need to protect myself. Folks are envisioning themselves as I'm likely to maybe have to shoot someone in a threatening situation. But that's not how this seems to play out. It mostly seems to play out typically amongst a very specific subgroup of folks who themselves have been shot. Whether that occurred during the course of this defensive gun use or not, no idea. That's not something we assess, right? We don't have any follow-up information about when these things happen chronologically. But it is to say that when defensive gun use happens in that form, it tends to happen amongst folks with a history of themselves having been shot with a firearm, not just amongst gun owners in general. It's also worth noting that if you look in the full sample, the most common forms of defensive gun use involve telling someone you have a firearm or showing it to someone, not actually shooting a firearm. Those are exceedingly rare. So when we talk about defensive gun use, people, I think, close their eyes and picture someone pulling a trigger, right? There being an exchange of fire. And that would be defensive gun use, not telling someone about it, not showing someone. And so we asked this question to get a sense of what people have done. But the definition of defensive gun use is going to vary from person to person. And most of the time it's endorsed by our definition. It doesn't involve actually utilizing the firearm. So this next slide is essentially the same table, but instead of lifetime, it's past year. The pattern is almost identical, except what you'll notice is the numbers are extraordinarily tiny, right? So defensive gun use happens, sure, but it's almost never happened in the past 12 months. Again, so we have 5 folks out of our 3,000 who have shot at a threat in the past 12 months. And again, sometimes the patterns, and when you've got numbers this small, you got to be really careful in terms of what you're saying about what they mean and what columns are different than one another. But sometimes something stands out. And I think that, again, when you hear about narratives about gun violence, you hear people waving their finger and talking about Chicago or New York City. But actually, all 5 instances of someone shooting at a perceived threat in the past 12 months occurred in the South. There was 0 in the Northeast. There was 0 in the Midwest. So the way we talk about what might happen or what's common or what's real, again, sometimes doesn't always line up with the numbers. But again, much like in the previous slide, where you see a largely consistent, but not 100% consistent pattern where the numbers are higher in these columns than others, are amongst the folks who themselves have been threatened with a firearm in the past or had been shot in the past, where again, the ones most likely to have engaged in defensive gun use in the past year and also to have been exposed to various forms of gun violence in the past year. Okay, one more table full of numbers, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about what I think these numbers mean. And I'm keeping my eye on the clock to make sure I leave a good amount of time for us to just have Q&A and a conversation. So the last question we haven't addressed is like, okay, well, amongst the folks with home firearm access, who are the folks most likely to actually engage in defensive gun use? Whether or not it's common or not, I still want to have a sense of who are the people most likely to have these experiences. And there are millions of variables we could have included, right? You start to put too many things into an equation, you lose your degrees of freedom, it becomes noisy, right? So are there other things I'd be interested in asking about in this? Absolutely. But what we decided to look at were some demographic factors, people's experiences with gun violence exposure, and their sort of practices sort of on a day-to-day basis with their own firearms. The demographics largely yielded nothing. There are a couple of sporadic small effects. Women were less likely than men to have showed their firearm to a perceived threat, but pretty small effect size. What you saw much more regularly were various forms of prior gun violence exposure being a predictor of greater odds of having engaged in defensive gun use. Also, greater levels of firearm carrying. So if you carry firearms on you outside of the home more frequently, you are more likely to have engaged in most forms of defensive gun use. And if you store your firearms at home, typically loaded and unlocked, so again, more readily, quickly accessible, you again had a general pattern of being more likely to have engaged in a couple forms of defensive gun use, although a little bit less robust than the carry and find use, which makes sense, right? If most of the defensive gun use is going to happen outside of the home, well, then it would be the people who are carrying the firearms on their home. That's going to be a much more impactful factor than how they're stored in the home itself. And so gun violence exposure and risky firearm practices are the most consistent and robust correlates of lifetime defensive gun use. It's really not a demographic thing. It's a behaviorally based thing and an experience-based thing. Now, I'd be curious to know if the gun violence exposure findings are explained by people's subsequent perceptions of threat. Do they see threat in ambiguous situations that other people don't because they themselves have experienced potentially life-threatening firearm-related experiences? We don't know that. I can't answer that with these data. We can certainly, guess, and we have some data to test that in other projects. But this is sort of a step one of that process. Okay, so what does this all mean? Let's start with the basic. Defensive gun use is rare. It happens, right? Nobody was coming into this saying, I bet this never happens. Of course it does. The question is how often, and pretty rare. And so 90%, 92% of those with home firearm access said they've never engaged in any form of defensive gun use, and the vast majority of those who did indicated that their form of defensive gun use didn't involve pulling a trigger. It involved talking about or showing a firearm, displaying it. If you were, and we were hesitant, we went back and forth, Dan Simmons and I, about should we use these data to give an estimate on how often this happened. And what we decided was that if we didn't, someone else would. So I'd rather start the conversation than rejoin it halfway through. But I will say, and I'll say this again at the end when we talk about limitations, when you're using survey data, drawing extrapolations about frequency, how often, exact numbers is something you want to be a little cautious about. But if you were going to extrapolate from our data to the US population, what you would say is we estimate approximately 195,600 annual instances of defensive gun use during which a firearm is discharged, either in the vicinity of or at a threat. So that's higher than the recent studies using NCVS, which again was restricted to instances that happened during the course of a crime, a documented crime, but far lower than the surveys that have often been used to promote permitless carry, for instance, or the ideas that are espoused in the Bruin decision. Also, less than 1% of adults with home firearm access have engaged in any form of defensive gun use in the past year, right? So if we're saying over the course of someone's lifetime they've done something, once that's different than saying this happens frequently. A little bit more about what this means. Well, it's not just that defensive gun use is rare. It's that even just amongst the same group of people, it pales in comparison to the occurrences of gun violence exposure. So if we're going to do that same exercise of, well, this is how often defensive gun use happens, well then, okay, we're going to do that for that. We're going to do this for this too. Let's find out what that means for everything, right? So if we're going to extrapolate from our gun violence exposure data, well, 33% of the sample heard gunshots in their neighborhood in the past year. Now, I will say the caveat with that variable, and we stopped using it so much in future studies or more recent studies, is that that means different things to different folks, right? Like, did you hear someone shooting guns in their neighborhood on July 4th? Well, that's different than hearing somebody shooting at somebody in your neighborhood, right? So it's a little bit ambiguous about what that means. And so we use some caution there. But still, 33% of the sample said they've heard gunshots in their neighborhood in the past year. So that equates to approximately 32 million people per year hearing gunshots in their neighborhood. 3% of the sample knows someone who died by firearm suicide in the past year. And that equates to 2.9 million firearm suicide loss survivors every single year. So certainly we can look at the instances of defensive gun use, as long as we're also comparing that to the instances of negative firearm consequences encountered by the same individuals. Now, I will say 0.2% of the sample indicated they've been shot in the past year, which I understand sounds like a small number, but when you extrapolate over a nation with 300 million people, that number gets bigger than you see in other places. So either that's an overestimate and it's just sort of a quirk of, we're talking less than 5 people, right? And so it doesn't take a lot of people to move the number uh, a little bit. So it might just be overestimated in consequence of the survey data, or it could be a sign that there are a lot of non-fatal firearm injuries that go unreported in their system. I will say, in this current season of the federal government canceling research grants, Dan Simmons had a NSF grant canceled, where the whole point was over the next couple of years was to build a national database of non-fatal firearm injuries. So we were going to work our way towards being able to explain this finding, but that has been canceled. There's also substantial overlap between those who have been shot and those who have shot others, right? And again, that speaks to how we think about the narrative of who's going to engage in defensive gun use and what does it mean to engage in defensive gun use, and what's the likelihood that each person is making decisions about what they're going to do, and should they have a firearm in their home, and should they carry a firearm outside their home. It might be framed by a narrative that doesn't actually map up to their own experience. But I also really just want to emphasize this point on the bottom here, is that our estimates of the frequency of gun violence exposure only include instances amongst folks with home firearm access, right? So this is how common this is amongst the 37.7% of homes with home firearm access. This doesn't include any of the gun violence exposure in the other almost 2/3 of the adults in the country, right? So the number I have here is a big number, and it's a severe underestimate of the number of adults in this country who've experienced gun violence. We're simply comparing these two different types of experiences amongst the same population. One more what does this mean slide. The most robust correlates to defensive gun use were gun violence exposure and unsafe firearm practices, be that carrying frequently outside the home or storing it unsecurely in the home. And so to me, this means that my interpretation is that folks who are more likely to see threat in the world and are more able to readily, quickly reach for a firearm are simply more likely to perceive threat and respond to it aggressively using a firearm, because all of those variables I just mentioned sort of set the stage for that. It's important to note, though, that perceived threats might not necessitate defensive gun use. But those who are previously exposed to violence, who have more ready access to firearms, just might be primed to perceive threat in ambiguous situations and to respond more aggressively, and in some cases fatally, because of their experiences and because they have armed themselves. Not because they're actually a greater threat or because they needed to do this, but because their perceptions moved in a certain direction and their environment was equipped to facilitate defensive gun use. And it's also simply worth reiterating, as I mentioned earlier, that simply because defensive gun use occurs doesn't mean it was required or helpful. It just means it happened. So the bottom line in all of this is that people have clearly internalized this message: the world's dangerous, and a firearm can help keep you safe. This has happened for a variety of reasons. We can talk about this during Q&A if folks want to. But that's fueling a lot of conversations about what people should do with firearms, how we should regulate access to firearms, how we should regulate who can carry firearms and where. And it's moved things in a way that doesn't, I think, line up with the data, certainly not the data in the study. And so how we frame the conversation matters, because the conversation is being driven by perceptions and fears, not by actual instances of the event that is supposedly driving the decision. So I want to note a couple limitations and a take-home point here. I'm going to wrap up here in a second. These are cross-sectional self-report data, right? So we're not able to predict, this happens here, then subsequently, several years later, this happens. We can't do that as cross-sectional data. Even if you frame the question to tell people to think about how things happen, people are notoriously bad at remembering the chronology of events, right? And self-report data is prone to all sorts of vulnerabilities, but it's still the best thing that we have available to us. And even, again, with large representative samples like we have here, extrapolating frequency estimates from survey data is difficult and requires caution. So we gave you those estimates because we felt like if we didn't, someone else potentially with pretty nefarious motives might do that. And so it seemed important for us to do it first and talk about what those numbers might mean and what their vulnerabilities are, than to just put out our percentages and wait for someone else to run with it. But the take-home points are a few things like, look, defensive gun use is exceedingly rare. and its frequency is tiny relative to gun violence exposure. That fact is not reflected by the nature of ongoing conversations that determine our policies and our laws and our, again, our personal in-home decisions amongst families. And I was saying before we launched this, and I was talking to folks sort of behind the scenes here, yeah, I don't come at this from an anti-gun perspective or judging folks for having firearms or anything along those lines. I spent most of my career working in South Mississippi, where firearm ownership is the norm. It's not the exception. Whereas I grew up in Connecticut and I live in New Jersey, where firearm ownership is exceedingly rare in both of those places, right? And I came to care and appreciate for and admire a lot of folks who see the world very differently than me on this issue and many others, right? And so what gets me frustrated is when people are making very important decisions about their safety and their homes and their families based off misinformation. If everybody's given the same information, we're still not all going to come to the same conclusion, right? People I respect and admire are going to look at this and make a fundamentally different interpretation about what they should do with their firearm. But at least they would have made that decision based on the accurate data. And so, a driving force for me in this is simply be like, look, I want people to make informed choices. And I still might not make the choice that I make, but man, how choices are made based on reality, not off of information that is often driven by financial motives. Okay, so look, the last thing I'm gonna say really quickly, man, if you appreciate the work we do at the GVRC, we want to keep doing it. And I mentioned there's some threats coming from the federal government, but I also do want to note that the current budget in the state of New Jersey, for the proposal for the coming year, Governor Murphy has proposed slashing our budget by $1 million, despite a $6.3 billion surplus. And so if you find that agitating, I certainly would not be agitated by you expressing that point to those who pull such levers. This is not a moment, as gun violence prevention grants are being canceled by the federal government left and right, for us to be slashing gun violence resources at home. I want to thank our wonderful GVRC members. So many people contribute to all the stuff we do. I want to thank you guys again for logging in, and for the folks at UConn for inviting me to do this. I'm going to stop my screen share. And I'm excited to take questions from folks and talk through the topic.
Michael, thank you so much for that presentation. I want to defer to our audience in any questions they might have, so feel free to unmute yourself and chime in, or raise your hand, or put your questions in the chat. To give y'all a second to organize what you want to say, if you have any questions, I have a couple of thoughts. So I think the obvious one, and given this is not causal, this is descriptive survey-based work, I'm going to ask you to speculate. But I mean, I think the obvious question is the sort of man with a hammer cliche. Is like, does having a gun, does the very fact of possessing a gun make you overweight your own probability of being threatened?
So there's social psychology research out there on the sort of weapons effect. And I think that, what folks have found is that it's, inflated a little bit. But yeah, the general idea is that when folks are holding a firearm or something that's like a firearm, and they're shown an ambiguous situation, they're more likely to perceive a threat and to respond aggressively to that perceived threat than someone who is not holding that. So the idea is that if you are yourself armed, you see the world as something that might require arms in response.
This is interesting to me, right? Because like there seems to be sort of two, like broadly speaking, two paradigms here. There's places where there's lots of guns all over America. So there are places where there's lots of guns and there are also lots of threats. I think these are the places where many of the people who have been exposed to gun violence and also report lots of defensive gun use live. And those places see high violence. And the causal direction is kind of difficult to pin down. But then there's a lot of other places in America where there are lots of guns, but very, very few threats. And what does that create? I mean, there's obviously like gun violence exposure in those places, but is there a lot of like morbidity and mortality related to guns in those many places in America where there's few threats, but lots of guns?
Yeah, so I think there are a few really important questions baked into that. And I'm going to do my best not to pull a Rick Perry and forget like my response halfway through. But there's a few things. So like one of them is, yeah, like there are some areas where there's lots of guns and there is lots of violence. And that's where you see maybe defensive gun use is more likely, right? And I think that when I was talking earlier about wow, such a high percentage of the folks who have shot at a threat have themselves been shot, and it makes me think about all the amazing work that CVI groups do, right? And how one of the reasons they're so effective is because they understand the dynamics of the social networks of the very small percentage of a particular community where the violence is happening, right? Like it's often the defensive gun use is part of an ongoing back and forth series of conflicts between specific networks of people, right? That it's not something that is descriptive of the entire community and population, although the fear is experienced by the entire community, but the actual uh, uh, gun use is restricted there, right? And so I think there are some communities where you're seeing that. And we've done a lot of work on threat sensitivity and people's perceptions and how that drives purchasing and storage and carrying of firearms and stuff. But what you also see getting into the second part of what you said is folks who live in areas where there's a decent amount of guns, there's not a whole lot of actual gun violence, not in their specific community anyways, right? And yet they feel this drive. And I think what we found is I think you've got sort of two different groups of folks. You've got folks who own firearms and carry because man, they look outside their door and they say, there's a real threat. I can tell you like the name of the threat that is right on the horizon. And then you've got other folks who are protecting themselves from an abstract idea of threat. The world is dangerous. It's not that I've seen something happen right here. Maybe I've seen it on TV, or maybe I envision it in my head, and it's this core value of being the protector of my family is so ingrained in who I am and culturally part of my identity that I need to protect against this abstract threat, even though it's not right there on the doorstep, it's there, and I cannot justify a situation where just because I can't name it, I don't defend against it. Because what if it comes against me and then I failed in my mission, right? So I think you see this people are defending themselves against two different things. For some folks, it's a very real, imminent threat based on their lived experience. And for other folks, it's an abstract threat that feels very real and very salient and extremely important to protect against. And what you see in that first category, and believe it or not, I think I'm actually going to land the ship. I don't think I forgot part of your question, is you see the community violence, right? And I think what you see in the spot where there's not a lot of those shootings is you see really high firearm suicide rates. So you do see high mortality, but that mortality comes from the firearms in their homes that where the actual threat was in the home. It was themselves.
Yeah, I think we forget that more than half of gun deaths are people committing suicide. This is true. So speculating yet again a little bit more about the sort of emotional motivation of people. Um, the people in these high exposure neighborhoods versus the people in low exposure neighborhoods. Do you feel like they have the same emotional motivation for carrying a firearm?
I think it's very similar. So we've been doing some qualitative research lately amongst young Black men who own firearms illicitly in Newark, for instance, and asking them just sort of like, why do you have firearms and what's your take on it? And there are some things that are different, right? So I think the biggest category is the overlap. It's this general idea of there's danger. And when I think about my role in all this, it's to protect, whether that's myself, it's someone I care about, it's my space, whatever it is. And this firearm is a tool that serves that purpose. And because a lot of times folks are not, we don't talk about, like you said, that, about 60% of gun deaths are suicide deaths, right? People aren't thinking about those as salient real threats. That happens to other people. The real threat to me that could happen to anybody is someone coming after me, right? So I need this firearm here. And so for a lot of folks, it really is that shared core belief of I must protect myself. Again, is it against a known, readily identifiable threat or an abstract one? Well, that varies. I do think, though, that there's also, if you look at, so 2020, you saw the biggest surge in firearm sales that we've ever at least noted empirically, right? And those, it's not new to have a surge. There are surges, you can predict them like when they think Democrats are going to take power or after a high profile mass shooting. A lot of times there are surges in purchasing. But 2020 was unprecedented. And what really also made it stand out, distinct from other surges, not just the magnitude of it, but was who's buying it. So Matt Miller's crew, I think, and Cass Kravatsi's crew both put out studies sort of characterizing who the new firearm owners were there. 50% identified as female, 20% as Black, 20% as Hispanic, Latinx. You were seeing the demographics of firearm ownership shift too. And so I think, and then we have some data that is not out yet, but we gathered some data where we had a national sample right before election day 2024, and then in the opening weeks of 2025, and looking at who's purchased and whose perceptions have changed. And I think you also have a narrative, folks who feel marginalized right now by the current government are also more likely to want to carry their firearms right now. There's an element that's, I think there's the shared, I just want to protect myself, right? And then there's also, I think, a separate line of folks who are marginalized by their local government, by the federal government, by whatever, but who feel outside the protection of the system. That also is an additional thing. And I think that part of that is being shaped by aggressive marketing of firearms to new markets who did not typically make up such a high percentage of people buying guns.
As somebody who lives in Washington D.C., I worry about the marginalized federal employees flocking to gun stores. Um, so one of the things that really struck me in your charts was the by far the most prevalent indicator of gun violence exposure was hearing a gunshot, which I guess makes sense because sound travels really far. There's also a lot of things that can be mistaken for a gunshot. Um, but I mean, it sort of like what also struck me about was the high ratio of like past year exposure versus lifetime. It was like half of all people reported having heard gunshots in their neighborhood in their lifetime, and then like a third of all people said that they'd heard it in the past year. Is is that something that is just sort of indicative that about half of all neighborhoods just have a lot of gunshots all the time, or is that indicative of something that's changed since maybe last year or 2020 or name your start date?
I, you know, if you ask, so I haven't heard a lot of, I've heard things that I thought were gunshot. I wouldn't say I never have. That's not true. So I would say I have, but it's not been a regular experience. Um, and I suspect some of the times I thought I heard was, a car backfired, something, right? Like I don't really
Mhm.
know for sure. So I think some of this is just, it's an inflated number because people again are saying, I think that's what I heard, right? But it's not like it's been confirmed that that's what that was. Part of it, like you said, is sound travels far, right? And that's a loud sound. So was it in your neighborhood? What does neighborhood even mean? I don't know, but I heard it. So there could be that. I don't know that it's some sort of new trend. But also again, remember, as I mentioned earlier, uh, hearing a gunshot doesn't mean hearing a shooting necessarily. Like there's a shooting in the sense that someone shot a fire, but not that they shot it at someone, that there was a conflict. How many of those folks have heard it on July 4th?
Right.
Um, Again, there are a lot of instances where people celebrate by shooting a firearm up, or do you live in a rural space and there's hunting? And during hunting season, I have in fact heard people's rifles going off in the background and that sound carried. Okay.
Sure.
Does that mean the same thing as someone who says, yeah, I heard someone get shot right outside my apartment? No, it does not. So it's, again, that's the variable where it's like, I use the most caution. I would focus more, the same story is told by the other ones that have less ambiguity baked into their meaning. And so I tend to lean heavier on the other ones.
So, I think one question that strikes me is there sort of a way to have it both ways? People, I mean, you like we can conclude that in fact people's fear is unjustified, but that doesn't. I think most fear is unjustified, and so I would say like people are gonna be afraid, um, and they're gonna want to have easy access to their firearms. They're not gonna want to keep it in a gun safe or keep it in some box in their car. Most people are going to want to like be able to access it very quickly for use. But also we want to promote safety and we want to promote it not getting into someone else's hands so they can hurt themselves or hurt others with it accidentally or on purpose. Is there kind of a way to have it both ways? Is there a way to both have sort of ready defense in case of a situation where you need it and safe storage?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to get at that. One is like, look, we don't actually know the storage method or number of methods or combo of methods that bestows the greatest level of protection. So when we talk about secure storage with folks one-on-one or in larger settings, I see it as a continuum. And that people, based on their comfort level and their value system and their own home situation, different things make sense for them. So what I'm always trying to do is move people along that continuum in a way that's values consistent so they're likely to sustain the behavior. And sometimes that means switching locking mechanism. Like, would you use a biometric lock? Some people are like, yes, I like that because it's quick. Other people are like, no, the technology might fail. I don't trust it, right? Different people feel differently about that. Um, Other people, it's will you do it under certain circumstances, right? But the idea is, I think a lot of this is sort of abides by the principle of inertia. So we've often had people, so for instance, I tell the anecdote all the time, the initial clinical trial of Project Safeguard, our lethal means counseling intervention, we had a guy who came in very early and he was suspicious of all of it and told us it didn't make any sense. He wasn't going to do any of this. We didn't think we'd see him again. And he showed up at his 3-month appointment and again reiterated it's a bunch of BS. I'm not going to do this, whatever. Showed up again at his 6-month appointment though and said, hey, since we last talked, I broke up with my fiance and I thought about the conversation we had way back at the beginning and I let my brother hold my guns and I'm pretty sure I'd be dead if I hadn't done that. And I think about it is that when we spoke to the guy at Project Safeguard Intervention, we use a approach called motivational intervention. You don't argue with folks. It's very much you work with them within their own intrinsic motivation and value system, make decisions that fit with them. And when you allow someone on their own terms within a way that maps onto their own identity to take an initial first step, you get past that inertia. Once it starts moving, people realize everything's fine. And then sometimes they're willing to take bigger steps on their own because it wasn't forced upon them. And I think so much of this, any of debate about firearms, ends up being an identity and a culture debate. People feel judged, evaluated by folks they don't relate to, who they feel are coming in and telling them what to do. And so what I try to do is create a space for people to decide what to do on their own and give them, again, accurate information and understand that I can't make everybody do the same thing. I can't. That's not going to happen. That's not my goal. Perfection ain't happening. But a lot of us agree on a lot more than we think we do. And if we just have a little bit of grace and give people the power to take a step forward, a lot of times they take a lot of steps, but they wanted to take them. They didn't want to be pushed by you. So I guess that's my long-winded answer.
Yeah, no. What's the next step with this particular research project?
With the defensive gun use, refining our questions a little bit, quite frankly. We're going to be launching our next survey in the next few weeks. And so we're in that final dash of refining questions to get over stuff, better understanding, how we could have worded things better, what the follow-up questions might be, what else we need to consider about what might explain things. But a lot of this is quite frankly just banging the table and getting this information out there, right? Trying to shape the narrative more publicly. We take science communication really seriously at our center and just really trying to, not get the data get buried in, ivory towers, but actually be useful in getting people to think about this a little bit differently. So I think that's sort of, yeah, I'm never going to be a defensive gun use researcher. I'm always going to be a suicide researcher, but this feels relevant to that in this very indirect way. And so it feels like I need to push this out there to accomplish my larger goal, which is to get people to feel safer in a way that's accurate.
Very, very useful, very helpful. We have 1 minute left. Oh, I have a question in the chat. Perfect. From Tom Campbell, how can you and the other universities studying this issue get together to refute the gun lobby's mouthpiece, John Lott, and his bogus research? Tom's words, not mine.
Well, I have no problem with those words. Yeah, look, I mean, it's part of it is having a commitment to science communication, right? I think historically scientists, one of the reasons it's so easy for the federal government to cancel grants and call it waste is because scientists come back and use jargon and say things that sound unrelatable. So it's beholden upon centers like ours and others to work collaboratively to message these things better, to reach folks, but also to collaborate with folks whose voices are trusted better. We do a lot of research that shows very clearly that me standing in a room full of people who disagree with me, spouting these stats is not going to resonate. But a law enforcement officer doing it or a military veteran doing it might, right? So we need to think creatively about how can we take the data we have and get it into the hands, or more importantly, behind the voices, the right channels that relate to the folks we're trying to convince, right? I'm never going to convince John Lott or the gun lobby because they're financially incented to do something different, right? They might already be convinced, right? I'm not convinced that they don't already believe this. That's not the point. That's just not what they're selling. So I'm not trying to reach them. I'm trying to move the great big middle. And what you'll find is that most firearm owners don't find the gun lobby to be a compelling voice at all, or think that they're represented by them. It's just that they don't find, so we actually had a study that just came out this past week. Yeah, we thought that the reason that conservatives who support policies like background checks, for instance, don't vocally demand them is that they probably thought that their peers don't. And so they don't want to alienate their community. So they don't. Turns out that was dead wrong. Our data show very clearly I could not have been more off on that, which made me re-examine. Is like it's not that people don't support this. It's just that isn't the priority for them, right? So the way we fight the gun lobby and the misinformation is by making this stuff a priority, by empowering people with the right data through a voice that's compelling. So it becomes a priority. Because right now, they're like, yeah, background checks make sense, but I'm really all in on abortion right now. And so this is the politician who supports that. So I'm going to go that way, right? And that lets John Lott and the gun lobby run freely. And all the pressure on this issue then comes from the gun lobby to the elected official. If we want the pressure to come from conservatives, it has to be a priority for them. For it to be a priority, they have to see it as real. For them to see it as real, someone who's compelling has to voice it. That ain't me, right? So the next step is me to get that to the right people, and for our other gun centers and other universities to get that to the right people and then build that momentum that way.
Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for all your good work, and thanks for everyone who joined us. Again, the next session will be on June 25th. We hope to see you then. And thanks again for your time.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.